Welcome to Royal Insights, where we explore the stories, traditions, and fascinating details behind royal families and dynasties from around the world. Join us as we uncover the history, culture, and curiosities that connect crowns across continents.
Imagine someone tells you their family business has been operating for 1,000 years. Your first instinct would be skepticism. A polite smile, the quiet assumption that someone is exaggerating or confusing continuity with mythology or counting in ways that don't quite hold up to scrutiny. And that skepticism would be reasonable, because think about what 1,000 years actually means. In 1,000 years, the English language transformed so completely that a modern speaker cannot read the original without years of specialized study. The borders of virtually every country in Europe were drawn, erased, and redrawn multiple times. Empires that seemed permanent, the Byzantine, the Mongol, the Ottoman, the Habsburg, rose, dominated the world, and collapsed into memory. Religions fractured, continents were crossed, technologies appeared that would have seemed like magic to anyone living at the start of that period. Almost nothing human survives 1,000 years intact. And yet, across Europe, several monarchies claim exactly that kind of longevity. Not as museum pieces, not as ceremonial remnants kept alive by nostalgia, but as functioning institutions, with living monarchs, recognized constitutions, and genuine roles in the political life of modern democratic nations. Which raises a question that sounds simple but turns out to be surprisingly deep. What are Europe's oldest monarchies? And what exactly does it mean to be old? Before we can answer the question, we need to confront a problem that historians encounter almost immediately. Age, when applied to a monarchy, is not a single measurement. It's at least 4 different measurements, and they rarely agree with each other. You could measure the age of the dynasty, the specific family currently on the throne. You could measure the age of the kingdom, the political entity the monarch rules. You could measure the age of the institution of monarchy itself in that territory, the unbroken tradition of having a king or a queen at all, regardless of which family it was. Or you could measure the age of specific constitutional arrangements that define what the monarchy actually does today. These 4 measurements can produce wildly different answers for the same country. Take the United Kingdom. Most people assume the British monarchy must be among Europe's oldest. The castles, the coronations, the endless parade of kings and queens through the history books, all of it suggests deep, unbroken antiquity. But the House of Windsor, the family currently on the throne, only adopted that name in 1917. Before that, they were the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a German dynasty that held the British throne since 1901. Go back further, and you find the House of Hanover, which came to Britain from Germany in 1714 because the existing royal line had run out of Protestant heirs. Go back further still, and you find the Stuarts, the Tudors, the Plantagenets, each a distinct family that acquired the throne through inheritance, marriage, conquest, or some combination of all 3. The United Kingdom as a political entity was formally created in 1707, when England and Scotland merged. Before that, they were separate kingdoms with separate monarchies. Before that, England itself had been conquered by the Normans in 1066, fundamentally transforming the ruling class and political culture. So when exactly did the British monarchy begin? Which starting point do we choose? This isn't a problem unique to Britain. It appears everywhere. And the honest answer is that the age of a monarchy depends entirely on what you're measuring and where you choose to start counting. With that caveat clearly in mind, let's look at the strongest cases. If there is one European monarchy with the most compelling claim to genuine, documented, continuous longevity, most historians would point to Denmark. The Danish monarchy traces its origins to the Viking Age, a period beginning roughly at the late 8th century when Scandinavian seafarers, warriors, and traders began reshaping the political map of Northern Europe and beyond. The earliest Danish kings emerged from this world, though the boundary between verifiable history and saga tradition is blurry enough that scholars argue about precise starting points. What is clear is this: by the time William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066 and decisively changed the course of British history, Danish kings had already been governing Scandinavia for generations. The Danish monarchy was already old when most of the political entities we think of as ancient European states were just beginning to take shape. The name most often cited as the founding figure is Gorm the Old, who ruled in the early 10th century and is generally regarded as the first king of a unified Denmark. His son, Harald Bluetooth, yes, the same name that now labels the wireless technology in your devices, borrowed as a tribute to a king famous for uniting different peoples, extended Danish power, and introduced Christianity to Scandinavia. From Gorm the Old to the present Queen Marguerite II, who abdicated in 2024 in favor of her son Frederick X, the Danish royal line represents one of the longest continuous dynasties in world history. Over 1,000 years of the same family on the same throne in an unbroken sequence. That is not a figure of speech. That is a documented genealogical and institutional fact. To put it in perspective, when the ancestors of the United States didn't exist as a political concept, when Shakespeare hadn't been born yet, when the Black Death hadn't yet swept Europe, Danish kings were already governing from a tradition that was centuries old. Sweden's monarchical history runs parallel to Denmark's in many ways, reaching back into the same Viking Age world of Scandinavian kingship and carrying the same challenge of separating documented history from saga and legend as you travel further into the past. The earliest Swedish kings are figures whose names appear in historical chronicles and Norse sagas with varying degrees of reliability. What matters for our purposes is that by the High Medieval period, the 11th and 12th centuries, Sweden had a functioning monarchical system that has never been formally interrupted since. The current Swedish royal family, the House of Bernadotte, is actually relatively recent. They've held the throne only since 1818, when the French-born Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte was invited to become heir to the childless Swedish king and eventually took the throne as Karl XIV Johan. This is one of history's more extraordinary career transitions. A general who had fought under Napoleon becoming the founder of a Scandinavian dynasty that still reigns today. But the institution of the Swedish monarchy itself predates the Bernadottes by centuries. The dynasty changed, the monarchy didn't. Norway's story introduces yet another layer of complexity that illustrates perfectly why measuring monarchical age is so difficult. On one hand, Norway possesses one of Europe's oldest royal traditions. Medieval Norwegian kings were significant figures in the broader history of Northern Europe, and the Norwegian royal sagas represent some of the richest historical literature of the Viking Age. Harald Fairhair, traditionally credited with unifying Norway in the late 9th century, stands at the beginning of a tradition that extends across more than 1,000 years. On the other hand, the modern independent Kingdom of Norway came into existence only in 1905. When the union with Sweden was peacefully dissolved and the country chose Håkon VII, a Danish prince, as its first independent king in centuries. Ancient roots, modern form, both entirely true. Norway is a 1,000-year-old monarchy that is also, in another sense, barely over 100 years old, and both statements are accurate simultaneously, which tells us something important about what continuity actually means. Beyond Scandinavia, Europe's oldest monarchies include some surprises. Countries where the age of the institution is not immediately obvious from the country's current size or global prominence. Consider Liechtenstein. The Principality of Liechtenstein is one of the smallest countries in the world. You could drive across it in the time it takes you to finish a cup of coffee. Yet the House of Liechtenstein, as we discussed in an earlier episode, has maintained both a ruling dynasty and substantial private assets across centuries of European upheaval. The Principality in its current form dates to 1719. When the Holy Roman Emperor combined two territories and granted them to the Liechtenstein family as an imperial fief, but the family's aristocratic history reaches back considerably further. What makes Liechtenstein interesting in this context is that it represents the survival of a very specific type of medieval political entity, the small, autonomous territory governed by a noble house that was nearly universal in pre-modern Europe, but has almost entirely disappeared. Liechtenstein is one of the last examples of what was once a continent covered in such arrangements. Monaco offers a similar case. The Grimaldi family has been associated with the governance of Monaco since the late 13th century, a claim that would make it one of the longest continuously ruling dynasties in European history. The specific form of that rule has changed dramatically over the centuries, and there have been interruptions and complications that historians argue about. But the basic fact of Grimaldi governance in Monaco across 7 centuries is difficult to dispute. The United Kingdom, despite the complications of measuring its age, deserves a longer look than the skeptical glance we gave it earlier. Because while the House of Windsor is recent and the United Kingdom as a formal entity is only 3 centuries old, the tradition of English monarchy itself stretches back to the early medieval period. The coronation ceremony used for British monarchs today contains elements that descend from ceremonies performed in the 10th century, making it one of the oldest continuously practiced rituals of state in the Western world. The specific words have changed. The specific family has changed, but the ceremony, in recognizable form, has persisted. That's a different kind of continuity than dynastic lineage, but it's a real kind. All of this leads to what I think is the most important insight in this entire story. The oldest monarchies in Europe are not the ones that resisted change. They're the ones that were best at managing it. This runs counter to our intuitive sense of what makes something ancient and durable. We tend to associate great age with stability, with unchanging permanence, with institutions that somehow stood still while history moved around them. We imagine the Danish monarchy as a kind of a 1,000-year-old stone fortress, solid and immovable. The reality is almost the opposite. The Danish monarchy survived 1,000 years because it continuously transformed itself. Viking Age kingship looked nothing like medieval kingship. Medieval kingship looked nothing like the absolute monarchy of the 17th century. The absolute monarchy of the 17th century looks nothing like the constitutional monarchy of today, in which the monarch performs entirely ceremonial functions, while elected governments make all real decisions. At each of these transitions, the institution could have been lost, and many were. The monarchies that clung too tightly to the specific form of power they held at one moment found that when circumstances changed, and the circumstances always change, they had no flexibility left. They broke. The ones that survived bent. They surrendered political authority to parliaments when parliaments became irresistible. They accepted constitutions that limited their power because a limited monarchy was better than no monarchy. They reinvented their public roles, becoming symbols of national identity and cultural continuity rather than governors in the direct sense. They learned, generation after generation, that the crown's value lay not in what it controlled, but in what it meant. This is the difference between a dynasty and an institution. Dynasties are families. They are bound by biology, by inheritance, by the accidents of who is born and who dies and who produces heirs and who doesn't. When a dynasty ends, as dynasties always eventually do, it ends. An institution is something different. It's an idea that can outlast the specific people who embody it. The monarchy of Denmark is not the House of Gorm. It's something that Gorm's family started, and that has passed through many hands since, surviving the extinction of bloodlines and the replacement of dynasties by treating the institution itself as a thing worth preserving. The crown proved more durable than the family wearing it. So what are Europe's oldest monarchies? By the most rigorous measure of documented continuous institutional history, Denmark stands at or near the front of any honest list, with Sweden and Norway close behind. By the measure of specific dynasty, the Grimaldis of Monaco and the House of Liechtenstein present remarkable claims. By the measure of ceremonial and constitutional tradition, the British monarchy contains elements of genuine antiquity, even if its family tree is thoroughly tangled. But I think the more interesting answer to the question is one that emerges when we stop measuring age as a number and start asking what survival actually required. Because the monarchies that are old today are not old because they were frozen in time. They are old because they were never frozen. They moved when movement was necessary. They gave up what needed to be given up. They adapted their justifications, their ceremonies, their roles, and sometimes their very names to whatever the current century demanded. Think of them less as ancient stones and more as ancient rivers. A river is the same river even though none of the water in it today was there a year ago. It maintains its identity, its name, its path, its place in the landscape through constant movement, not despite it. The water changes completely, the river endures. That is what Europe's oldest monarchies have accomplished. The world around them transformed beyond all recognition. The justifications for their existence changed completely. The powers they held were given away piece by piece until almost nothing executive remained. And yet, the institution persisted. Recognizable, meaningful, still capable of evoking something in the people who live beneath its symbolic canopy. A sense of continuity, of national identity, of connection to a past that extends further than any living person can remember. 1,000 years is a remarkable number, but the most remarkable thing about it is not its size. It's about what had to happen, what had to be surrendered, transformed, and reinvented to reach it.